of his own will, of the Father's own will, he, the Father, brought us forth by the word of truth. That sounds like James is talking about being born again from above. James, the very author that Catholics will run to try to defend salvation by grace plus works, is the very author that reconfirms salvation by grace. Katelyn, hopefully these answers help you out. You're listening to The Foreign Saints. For the rest of you, I'm Saint K, reviving the hearts of those who die daily to keep Christianity distinct in this world that always wants to water us down. Okay, we are continuing the Answers series. This is an ongoing series where I take theological questions, theology and practice questions from people, and answer them to the best of my not insignificant ability. All right, so the question on the docket for this particular episode is James chapter 2 verse 24 in contradiction with Ephesians chapter 2 verse 8? Now, Katelyn, understand that you have more questions than that that are pending that you'll send to me shortly, but I thought that this particular question concerning James and how to properly read James was worthy of its own episode, partly so that it wasn't just one massive super long episode that was a little bit difficult to listen to all in one sitting. All right, so let me go ahead and open some things up, because before we get into James, I want to give you a couple of foundation stones of knowledge that we can build upon and reason from in the future. All right, so let me show you this screen right here. Let me see. Share. Click. Boom. All right, so what you're seeing on the screen right now is Codex Sinaiticus. All right, Codex Sinaiticus, it was a 4th century manuscript of, the entirety of the Bible. I mean, there were manuscripts of each individual books of the Bible long before Sinaiticus, but Sinaiticus was one of the first, if not the first, full compilation of all the books together. And so what you see up here, we're actually looking at the book of James in the original Greek right here up on the screen. Well, not the original manuscript, but the original language, just right here up on the screen. And as you can see, there are not any verse numbers. This little mark here and this mark here are not actually numbers. No, those are Greek letters. And you can fact check this on your own, just going to codexsinaiticus.org. And then you can just pick your book from the drop down menu up here. But the reason I wanted to show you this is so that I could prove to you what I said to you earlier, which is that the chapter verse distinctions and subject headers are not in the original manuscripts. They're not even in a lot of earlier middle manuscripts. They don't actually show up until like the 1500s or something like that. This website here, gotquestions.org, is another good resource just for quick answers and to kind of get your feet wet before you really dive into the deep end of any pool. But let's see here. Yeah, the chapter divisions commonly used today, developed by Stephen Langton, an Archbishop of Canterbury. He put the modern chapter divisions into place around AD 1227. And the Wycliffe English Bible of 1382 was the first Bible to use that chapter pattern. All right. As far as the Old Testament, that was divided into verses by a Jewish rabbi named Nathan in AD 1448. And then Robert Eastine was the first one to divide the New Testament into standard number verses in 1555. So it's really not until that time and a little bit after it that this was accepted into nearly all versions of the Bible. So the actual verses themselves created around, in the 1200s, they wouldn't become standard until the mid 1500s. Before those points, though, Bibles would have looked like this. I mean, not this language, and maybe the type would have been a little bit prettier by then, but you wouldn't have had any numbers. Nah, you wouldn't have had any numbers, right? So the question then becomes, right, then what was the point of adding the numbers if they've got no literary value? Well, the verses and chapters and the subject headers as well are additions to the inspired text to aid in navigation, in citation, and in common reading. Why do I start this episode on James chapter 2 and salvation by works or by grace of all things on this? Because when you know this about the verses, that they don't have any literary value, they're just street addresses, they just help you navigate. When you know that, then I think you'll begin to understand how silly it is most of the time to quote a single verse in isolation of other verses, right? There are some select places in Proverbs or whatever where it makes sense to quote one verse in isolation, but most of the time, that's butchering the text, or at least it can very easily predispose you to butchering the text when that's not your actual intention, right? The same way, this is an analogy, the same way that the address of your home, right? Your home has a address to it. That address, that number and street combination tells me nothing about what's inside your house itself, only where to find your house amongst the city that it's in. So too, chapter verse addresses tell you nothing about what's inside the verse. They tell you nothing about what the verse says, only where to find it amongst the city of the Bible. Another analogy that might help. The Bible is a library of books, right? The Bible is not one book, it's a collection of books. All libraries are collections of books, and every collection of books has some kind of system for finding books or finding places. Modern libraries use the Dewey Decimal System. Think of the chapter verse addresses in the Bible as the Dewey Decimal System of the Bible. Now, all that is important, right? Because again, when you realize that, the question as constructed seems a little bit silly because there is no James 2 or Ephesians 2, right? There is Paul's letter to the church in the city of Ephesus, which we call Ephesians, and James's letter to the quote 12 tribes of the dispersion or diaspora. In other words, Christians that come from a Jewish background, right? So the question, in my opinion, is probably more properly worded as, does the theology taught by James contradict the theology taught by Paul in his letter to the Ephesians, right? And last foundation stone before I really get into answering your question, books of the Bible don't fight each other, but people who read those books do. All right. And let me show you what I mean by that. Coming to, let's see, let's use this tab. In Galatians 2, we have a record of James and Paul agreeing on the teaching of the gospel. According to Paul, he went up to Jerusalem after, like 14 years or so of doing ministry. He goes up to Jerusalem with Barnabas and Titus to go, I guess you might say, check in with the 12 apostles and their elders, right? The Jerusalem church, all of that. But let's see here. So that's what Paul goes up there to do. Verse 6, from those who seemed to be influential, those, I say, who seemed influential added nothing to me. So in other words, Paul went to go check in with the apostles and their elders in Jerusalem, the elders that the apostles appointed in Jerusalem, to share notes, right? Hey, man, this is what I'm preaching. Is it legitimate? Like, are we on the same page about the gospel? And according to Paul, those who seem to be influential, the leaders, they didn't add anything to him that he didn't already have. On the contrary, says Paul, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, um, and when James and Cephas and John, Cephas is Peter, but you see, James was there. When James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. Only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. So according to Paul, he was preaching the same gospel that James was. He was preaching the same theology that James was. So if the real life authors, Paul and James, in real life, in reality, agreed on doctrine, then people coming 2,000 years later believing that Paul and James contradicted each other in theology, those coming 2,000 years later have to be the ones that are misunderstanding things, because the authors actually spoke to each other. They spoke to each other about theology and came to the conclusion, yes, you and I are saying the same things. You and I believe the same things, right? You can also read the story of the Jerusalem Council on your own for homework in Acts chapter 15 and get back to me, with what you found in there. In my opinion, Catholics seem to love quoting every one of their later church councils, but the one church council that's recorded in Scripture gets set aside because it conflicts with so much of their theology. But that's a conversation or an episode for another time. For now, let's go ahead and jump into the text. All right, Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8 says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God." Verse 9 as well, "not a result of works, so that no one may boast." And then, we'll use this one again. James 2, verse 24 says this, "You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone." Right? So if all you had were those two verses, those two or three verses, just ripped out of their context, nothing coming before, nothing coming after, right? If that's all you have, then yeah, it does seem like a contradiction. It does indeed appear that way, right? But again, these verses are not meant to be taken on their own, right? Because again, these verse numbers don't exist, right? Let me show you what I mean. Let's see here. If I go up to formatting, I can take away the verse numbers. I can take away the chapter and verse numbers. I can take away the non-biblical subject header text. And now look at the text, right? Now look at the text. There's no verse number for your eye or your mind to key in on. If you were looking at the text like this, you would know that to come way down here, right? You would know that to come way down here and to key in on this sentence alone and rip that one sentence out of its context, you would know that that's a bad reading technique. Like, you would know that, right? If I were to come over here to Ephesians 2, and let me come back up to formatting, let me rip away all that extra stuff. If you were to come up here, if it wasn't for the fact that I myself highlighted this, you would have no numbers for your eyes or your mind to key in on. You would know that ripping this verse, that ripping these verses out of their context is a bad way to read. You would know that, right? But not a lot of people actually know that the chapter verse numbers have no literary purpose. They're just street addresses to help you get around, to help you help others get around. Right? When you know that, then you know, oh man, I guess that means that all I got to do is read. Yeah, all you got to do is read. It's all that you got to do. All right. So, again, when you're looking at that, it means you actually got to look at the context, right? So we got to come back up to verse 14. Verse 14 is the beginning of the context here in James. And yeah, we're doing this without verse numbers. We're doing it the old school way. James here will say, what good is it? This is how he opens up this section. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith, but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also, faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. When you're reading this section of James, right? I mean, really anywhere in the Bible, I would say, the examples that the author is giving, if the author gives examples to prove their point, which they usually do, use the examples that the author is giving as your primary guide for interpretation, right? The examples that James gives here are of religious hypocrisy, people saying bold things and living weak lives. Because intellectual agreement with a data set is not faith on its own. Faith has an action to it, right? You do have to intellectually agree with a data set to have faith in something, right? But you actually have to add trust in there as well. You have to add a commitment in there as well. Without those things, faith is dead. It's absolutely dead. You know, he says here, someone will say, you have faith and I have works, right? Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. That's James's response, right? To people that say, well, you have faith, but I have works, which is kind of how Catholics like to talk. Oh, I don't like to use denominational distinctions, by the way, so I kind of feel icky even using the word Protestant, to be honest. But for your sake, Katelyn, I will use that word. You know, Catholics will come at Protestants and be like, oh, well, you guys just have faith. You guys have a lazy spirituality, but we Catholics, you know, we have works. We understand that we actually have to grow up and do something in the world, right? That's what they'll say. James's response to that is, show me your faith apart from your works. I'll show you my faith by my works. All right. You believe that God is one, you do well, right? That's intellectual agreement to a data set. You believe that God is one. Good. Good, he says. You know? Ooh. But guess what? Even the demons believe, and they shudder. Even the demons believe, and they shudder. It's not enough to have the right facts in your head. Do you have the proper faith in your heart? Is it resulting in actions of obedience? Right? James continues on. Do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? Wasn't Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? Again, if you ripped that sentence on its own out of this paragraph, that sounds like salvation is by works. But keep reading. You see, says James, that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. They're two sides of the same coin. Yes, faith was completed by his works, yes, but at the same time, faith was active along with his works. They go together. They can't be separate, right? Not in the healthy Christian. And the scripture was fulfilled that says Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. Isn't that interesting? James is affirming, he says that the scripture is fulfilled when it says in Genesis that Abraham was counted righteous simply because he believed God. Simply because he believed God. Okay, well, if that's true, then what did James mean when he said that Abraham, when he asks if Abraham was justified by his works? Here's the thing, right? He's using the word justification, not in the same tight, rigorous theological sense that Paul is using the word justification in the book of Romans, right? What James is saying here is that his faith was proven to be authentic when he put action behind it, right? When he put action behind it, that's when his faith was proven. And the example that James uses here is with the most stunning example of faith in Abraham's life, which is the offering of his son, Isaac, right? You could have used other examples, right? You technically could have said that Abraham's that one of the actions that Abraham took that proved his faith was genuine was the fact that he left his homeland in the first place. That's an action that he would not have taken if he didn't actually have faith, right? But you should be able to do that in every believer's life, right? There's actions in your life, Katelyn, that you have already taken that you would not have taken if you lacked a true saving faith in Jesus, right? Like, you know that about yourself, but you knowing that, you would never claim that, oh, I guess that means that my works are what saved me. No, you have an understanding that those faith-filled works came after that initial moment of your salvation. We all like that. That should be an intuitive thing, but you know, Catholic doctrine has a way of twisting you up about very obvious things. Here's an example, though, in the Gospel of Luke, of faith and works, how they interact. Right, the story of Zacchaeus. Right, I won't get into all of it. I'll just summarize it. But you can go read the story on your own for extra homework, I guess. Or I guess you could pause the screen and just read what's on the screen, right? Luke chapter 19, verses 1 to 10. Zacchaeus, he was a tax collector. He repents and comes to Jesus. And when he does, what Zacchaeus says to Jesus, he says, "Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold." He says fourfold because that was the command in the Old Testament. Conversation for another time. But look at Jesus' response. He says, "Today salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." All right. Zacchaeus had a living faith because it was accompanied with proper action. However, think about this. Those actions weren't yet done. They weren't even started, right? He said he was going to give half of his goods to the poor, and then if he had defrauded anyone of anything, he was going to restore it fourfold. He hadn't done that yet. There was no time skip in this section of scripture. He hasn't even started on these tasks yet. Those are tasks that he will do in the future, probably the immediate future, because of his current faith in Jesus, right? But if salvation were by grace plus works instead of grace alone, then Jesus should have answered this man that salvation was on its way to his house, not that salvation had already come to this house. No. He should have said, salvation is on the way to this house, contingent on Zacchaeus finishing his works, obviously. But no, Jesus says that salvation has come today because the man, present tense, is a son of Abraham. Because he is a son of Abraham. And lastly, back in James, right? Your question was about James chapter 2, but I want to show you something earlier in James chapter 1, right? That really frames this. That I think really frames this. It's James chapter 1, verses 16 to 18. But again, keeping the verse numbers up out of here. Way earlier, you see here, right? James says here in his first chapter. So this is before we get into a conversation about how faith and works go together. This is what he says. He says, "Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Do not be deceived." All right, what does that mean? Well, it means, well, obviously it means don't be deceived. That's a phrase, this is a phrase that tends to show up to denote that what's about to be said is something that people can easily be deceived about. It's like, hey, pay attention. Hey, don't let people trick you about this topic that's very easily to be tricked on. That's very easily to be, to be tripped up about, right? So what does he say? Verse 17 here. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Right? Every good gift, every perfect gift comes from the Father who does not change. Do not let people trick you into thinking that the Father is not the source of all good and perfect gifts. Okay, James, I get the point. But this is his bombshell. Verse 18, of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creation. Whoa. James right here just said that we as believers were brought forth by God's own will via the word of truth. Does that sound familiar? Because it should. I'm gonna put our verses and stuff back. Does that sound familiar? Because it should. All right. In John, in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 9 says, the true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. Verses 12 and 13, that's speaking of Jesus. Verses 12 and 13 says, to all who did receive him, Jesus, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. All right. John's gospel says that Jesus is the true light, begotten by the Father of lights. And that all who receive Jesus were born by the will of God, just like James says. We believers are born by the will of God, not by the will of man, not by the will of the flesh, not by our own efforts. Right? Fast forward to John chapter 3, verses 3 to 8. Again, you got it on the screen. You can pause and you can look, but you see Jesus speaking of the necessity of being born again of God. In this particular context, he's emphasizing being born again by the Spirit of God, right? So when you remember those things that John's gospel taught, and then you come back here to James, verses 17 and 18 of chapter 1, right? Every good gift, every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights. And what is the best gift? What is the most perfect gift that the Father of lights has given to his children? The light of the world. The best gift that the Father of lights ever gave to us was the light of the world, of his own will. Of the Father's own will, he, the Father, brought us forth by the word of truth. Right? That sounds like James is talking about being born again from above. He's literally quoting John 1 and John 3 regarding salvation. So don't let people trick you into thinking that your salvation came about by your works. James, the very author that Catholics will run to try to defend salvation by grace plus works, is the very author that reconfirms salvation by grace, telling you to not be deceived about this, in part because he probably knows that the discussion of faith and works that he's about to get into in the next chapter can be confusing for people. So don't get it twisted, folks. You were brought forth by the Father's own will, not by your works. Right? Not by your works. But James wants to get practical. Right? He says, because the Father brought you forth, right? If the Father really did bring you forth, if the Father really did cause you to be born again spiritually, then there's some life change that we're expecting to see. There's some life changes that we're expecting to see. There's some changes in your life that we're expecting to see. Right? But again, the changes in your life happen after God changes you, not before. Not before. All right, so I hope that was a good appetizer for things to come. I'm very eager to see what your next questions will be. Getting into probably some church history and church father type of stuff, but hopefully this helps. Hopefully this helps. Until next time, folks, I'm Saint K. This has been the Foreign Saints. Go in peace.